Hi, I'm Doug George, moderator Doug_G, if you see me on the forum, very cryptic name. Tom is Chief Science Officer for Plug-in America, and by day he's a computer programmer. And he's done a lot of research into the longevity of Tesla battery technology and some other brands, and he's going to present his latest data to us today.
Thanks, Doug. Let me give you a little bit of background. So when the Leaf started showing some apparent battery pack degradation issues in the hot climates, there was a bunch of talk about that and a bunch of anecdotes, and I was curious to know, if I collect a bunch of data, will I be able to see a trend? And so that was the first formal battery survey I did was for the Nissan Leaf. And then I'm a Tesla owner as well as a Leaf owner, and a Roadster owner, that is to say. And I was curious about those. And I'd done a small sort of private study where I'd looked at some Roadsters in the Seattle area, and I wanted to open it up. So I added that survey to the Plug-in America website and started getting a bunch of data from Roadster owners. And then a little while after the Model S came out, I was surprised how quickly the Model S community was interested in getting data about how their battery packs are holding up. So I added that Model S survey. So I've been collecting data since 2012, and what I'm going to do is show you some of the things that I figured out from the data, and also all of the data is available. So if anybody else is interested in looking at this to see, answer questions they might have, you can download it yourself from the website and play with it, and feel free to contact me. I'll put my email at the end. And I want to collaborate with the community to figure out answers to questions that the community cares about. So let's get started. So the Model S survey, I've got 314 vehicles that have submitted data. I've had 167 of those vehicles that were either added or updated since I did this talk last year. Altogether, those vehicles account for 5.7 million miles. And amazingly, that's averaging 19,000 miles per year per vehicle. So Model S owners just drive the heck out of their cars, which is awesome. I love that. Out of curiosity, how many people were here at the battery talk last year? Okay, so maybe a little less than half. Good. Okay, so some of this will be familiar if you were here last year, and hopefully it'll also be accessible for people who are seeing this for the first time. So I'm going to tell a story with pictures, and my pictures are graphs. So my first graph is showing all of the data from the Model S survey. I've broken it down by the two models, the 60 kilowatt hours, the 85 kilowatt hours, and the 85 performance. I actually don't have much. I think I only have one P85D, so I'm definitely interested in getting more data from some of the newer models, but this is my main data set. And so what this is showing is on the vertical axis, it shows me how many rated miles they get after they do a 100% charge. And then the horizontal axis shows me how many miles they've driven. So you can see I've got vehicles as high as, I believe those were 92 and 98,000 miles, and right about 250 rated miles. And you can see from the data, there's a bunch of variation, so there's quite a bit of difference from car to car, but you can see that as those miles increase, sort of the group slowly loses a little bit of capacity. And then, so the red guys are the 85 kilowatt hours, the greens are the 85 performance, and then the blues are the 60, so that you can tell that's a separate group. And again, both of those, all of those groups have that behavior that they kind of slowly drop down. So now it'd be nice to compare those two. I want to see how the 60s compare to the 85s, but they have different rated miles. So what I do is for each of those vehicles, for the 85s, I divide by 265 rated miles, and for the 60s, I divide by 208. And so that'd be 100%. So if you're getting 100% charge that exactly matches that EPA number, then your car will show up at 100%. And then as you slowly lose a little bit of range with more miles, you can see the trend slowly creeps down. And you can see the blue dots are kind of following the same trend that the red dots does. So that gives me, shows us that both lines of cars, both kinds of battery pack are behaving similarly. There's not a big difference. Now there's a second issue. So the first thing I did to make it so that I can compare those two types of vehicles together is I divided by the rated miles. But there's another difference in those vehicles, right? So every time someone drives a Model S60, say 208 miles, as far as the battery is concerned, that's like driving the Model S85 265 miles. So I kind of want to normalize for that. So in order to do that, I'm going to actually do a couple of things. I want to normalize for how many kilowatt hours you've pulled out of the pack, and also normalize for the pack size. And the Model S has another great feature. I wish the Roadster had this. The Model S has a couple of trip meters that shows you kilowatt hours as well as miles. And because it has a couple, most Model S owners leave one of them. A lot of Model S owners have never reset the trip meter, so they know how many kilowatt hours they've pushed through their pack from the day they took delivery, which is totally awesome. And that's what this graph is showing us. It's showing us what people have told me their kilowatt hours per mile is. That's the that's the vertical axis. And then the horizontal axis is how many miles they had on their trip meter when they gave me that number. So you can see, I've got people out there at over 80,000. One of the 90,000 mile cars is obviously the trip meter is basically run since the beginning of time. And so you can tell, look at how many dots I've got past, at I've got the majority of the points showing more than 10,000 miles of driving. And so that means it really is an average of how they've driven the car. It's not going to be I went on a road trip and used maybe an average amount of energy, or I had a really rambunctious drive up to the mountain pass and used a whole bunch. So I think these represent a meaningful number. And you can notice there that there's a gigantic amount of variation. So I have a couple of low outliers there that are averaging just 250 watt hours per mile. So that's pretty efficient driving. And at the other end, I've got kind of low miles, but there's one there that's about 440 watt hours per mile. And there's another one that's about 15,000 miles, and that's still 425 watt hours per mile. So obviously, if you're driving like that, then the number on your odometer isn't telling you the whole story, because you're really pushing more power through that battery pack than those miles represent. So now I'm going to show you. So I can use that data. I can say, oh, look, so this Model S driver is averaging this many watt hours per mile, and they've driven that many miles, so I can estimate their total kilowatt hours through the battery pack. And then I divide by the size of the battery pack so that I can compare the 60s and 85s together. So let's see what that graph looks like. Okay, so this is similar to the previous graph. 100% means that you're matching the original EPA estimated range. But now the horizontal axis is how many times you've pushed whatever your pack size is through the battery pack. So how many times you've pulled 60 kilowatt hours out of a 60 or 85 kilowatt hours out of an 85. And you can see, again, the sort of the trend line of the 60s and the trend lines of the 85 is about the same. So that tells me that the performance of the two different kinds of battery packs, once I normalize for how big they are and how many kilowatt hours the drivers are using, are performing pretty well. So I think that means that whether you have a 60 or whether you have an 85, you've got great battery chemistry and you're getting nice performance. So now I can start asking some really interesting questions. The first question is, my survey work started with the Leaf, where there's clearly a climate issue. If you live in a really hot climate, it's not so good for the early Leaf batteries. We think Nissan's improved that. But so what about the Model S? Tesla's got this great technology. They liquid cool the battery pack. How is that affecting dependence on climate? And that's what this graph is all about. So what I'm graphing here is, again, the pack capacity as a percentage of the original capacity. And you'll notice I've changed the scale on the chart, so I've zoomed in a bunch. So instead of showing 0 to 100%, I'm narrowing in just on the variation. So I'm just showing from 88% up to 104%. And then I'm showing estimated pack cycles along the horizontal axis. But now I'm coloring the dots not by which model of car it is, but by the climate of the survey report. So what I do is I take the zip code, everybody gives me their zip code, and then I map that to an estimate of how hot it gets in the summer, and then I color the dots according to that summer temperature. So the red squares, those are the cars in the hot climate. And what do you notice about those compared to the others? They're all kind of mixed in the same. It doesn't really matter. The hot red cars and the cool blue diamonds, they all have kind of the same variation. So I think that's pretty compelling evidence that Tesla is doing an excellent job of keeping that battery pack healthy, controlling the temperature. And so it seems like probably doesn't matter whether you're in Seattle or in Las Vegas with the Model S, which is great news. Okay, so another question is, we know that there are different series of battery packs, and I've heard people talk about, this battery pack is, the newer packs are better than the older packs, and so I wanted to put that to a test. So another question I ask on the survey is I say, tell me what battery series you have. And so now what I'm doing is I'm showing the same data. You'll notice there's fewer points because not everybody gives me that information, but I'm coloring them according to which series of battery. And you can see that the A packs, those are the blue diamonds, and the B packs, the red squares, those are all mixed up pretty well. Now, if I look at the greens, it looks to me like the greens tend to be kind of more in the upper half. So maybe those D packs are holding up a little better. Maybe. I've got a few points there, I'm not really sure. So I would really love to have more data from those D packs. And of course, another issue is that the D packs haven't been around quite as long, so I'm not seeing quite as many miles. So that to me says that it's mixed in pretty well, but maybe there's an effect there, and I would love to get more data. Okay, I'll just talk a little bit about the Roadster. So I've got 165 vehicles in the survey. 41 of them are new or updated since I did this talk last year. They represented 4.5 million miles, and they're getting driven about 9,500 miles per vehicle per year. So a lot less than the Model S. Obviously, the supercharger network makes a gigantic difference. It's so easy to travel clear across the country that that's a little more of a challenge in the Roadster. So here is the Roadster data. You can see I only have a few vehicles that are really high up there. I've got a couple of vehicles that are close to 100,000 miles. And then I've got a report from Talk Radius. He's a Tesla owner in Germany. He's driven 124,000 miles on the original battery pack. He has about, he's at 76.8% of his original capacity, which I think is pretty amazing. What Tesla told us before we got our cars was that after 5 years of driving 10,000 miles a year, we should expect to have at least 80% of our original capacity. Well, you can see we're greatly exceeding that all of the vehicles except for the 124,000 are above that 80% mark. So Roadster owners, I think, are pretty happy with how the battery packs are performing relative to what Tesla told us to expect. Now, I noticed that if I just kind of draw a line that goes through the middle of all of those points, that the talk radius is a little below that line. So if I ignore his data point and do the best fit line for that, and then project it out to where he is, I would expect him to be at 81.1%, but he's actually at 76.8%. So he's about 5% lower than the trend line of the vehicles with fewer miles. So now I wonder what that means, right? Because with lithium-ion, what do we expect? We expect that the battery capacity is going to be relatively slowly declining for quite a while, and then eventually you get to some point, some people say 80%, maybe lower, that eventually you get to the point where the battery pack capacity drops rapidly. And so I don't know whether that's the effect that we're seeing here, or whether he's just a little bit below the average. Maybe if we had more points up at those higher miles, we'd have a better idea. But it's possible that now we're finally starting to see a battery pack that's kind of going over the edge of that hill. Maybe not. We'll see what. Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. So really high speeds. He's pushing maybe a lot of watt hours per mile through there. And the Roadster's trip meter, I found this out when I drove here last year. That I drove from Seattle, and about 20 miles from the hotel in Monterey, I crossed the 1,000-mile mark on my trip meter, which it's very fun to see that many miles. And the Roadster's trip meter can only show 3 digits, so it reset all of the stats. And so that was disappointing to me because I was keeping track of all the energy and everything, but that also means that I can't get long-term watt hours per mile data from Roadster owners. So I don't know. Maybe he's done a lot more pack cycles than his mileage would suggest. So that may be what's going on, and it maybe that we're still a long way from getting off that drop-off point on the Roadster batteries. So earlier this week, I was at Los Angeles at a conference called EVs in the Grid. And there were a bunch of utilities and automakers talking about some of the stuff that we've heard about today. So vehicle-to-grid stuff, demand response stuff. And another interesting thing that I knew I could do with the survey data is I could say, well, I know how much capacity you lose on average every time you cycle your battery for all these different models. And so that means I can say, how much capacity do I lose every time I pull a kilowatt hour out of my battery pack? And from that, I can say, well, okay, so what does that cost me? We actually have battery pack replacement costs for the Leaf and for the Model S. And those numbers are all around about $300 per kilowatt hour. So I said, well, so obviously driving puts wear and tear in your battery pack. What if I plug my car into the grid and let the utility pull electricity out of my battery pack to do peak shaving? What's that? How much wear and tear does that put on my battery pack? What does it cost me? So I crunched all of those numbers. I did it for the 60 kilowatt hour Model S, the 85 kilowatt hour Model S, and the Leaf. And for the Roadster, we don't have a new battery pack replacement cost on the Roadster, but I estimated that at $300 per kilowatt hour. And then the cost of replacement depends a little bit, well, it depends pretty strongly on how far I let my capacity get down before I choose to replace the pack. So if I decide that when I've lost 20%, so I'm down to 80%, that I want to replace my battery pack, then that costs me more per mile driven or per kilowatt hour than if I let it go all the way down to 70. So what this chart represents is for those 4 different models of vehicle and for the 2 different replacement strategies, letting it go to either 70% or 80%, what is the cost per kilowatt hour based on the data that I'm getting from the study? And so you can see there that it can be as low as about 18 cents per kilowatt hour. That's for the Model S 85 if I let it go all the way down to 70% before I replace it. And it can be up over 40 cents per kilowatt hour. That's for the Roadster with the assumed pack price if I decide to replace it at 80%. So that means if you're hooking your car up to the grid to be a grid storage device, that the utility better be paying you a number that is in that range. And you can see that's pretty expensive electricity. And it was interesting.
That assumes a zero value trade-in.
Yes. And actually, I think that's probably a reasonable assumption. There was a bunch of talk about second life batteries, and there's a bunch of issues with that. So yeah, it's possible you could get a value on your trade-in. Personally, I wouldn't count on that too strongly. So anyway, it's something to think about. And obviously, those bars are going to scale down. It wasn't too long ago that we were excited about batteries being $1,000 per kilowatt hour. Now they're down to $300 per kilowatt hour. If they're $100 per kilowatt hour, then all of those bars get dropped down by a factor of 3. But it's, anyway, something to think about. And I think it was interesting that the people at the conference, they're like, oh, wow, that's kind of expensive. They'd been thinking about it from the utility side and hadn't really been thinking about it from the car driver side. So hopefully that was informative to them. Okay, so what I'd like to do, so I'd like to give this presentation again next year and or write up papers. And so what do I want? Well, I want data from the dual drive vehicles. I'd like to see more data from the different battery pack series. I think that would be informative. I'd like to see, I know there's a bunch of Model S owners out there that have driven over 100,000 miles. I'd like to get their data. I'm also interested in early low-mile vehicles so that I can look for effects of where calendar life is leading to capacity loss as well as miles driven. And, obviously more data is more insight. So if you're a Roadster, a Leaf, or a Model S owner, please hop onto the website and give me your data. And there's my email address and the URL to where all the battery studies are. And now I'll take questions.
So line up at the microphone, please. And we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Hi, my name's Jay Gallagher. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina. I have a 2012 Nissan Leaf and a 13 Model S P85. Basically, the Leaf has gone to hell in a handbasket. 73 was rated. Now I'm lucky to get 51 or 2.
Uh-huh.
And that has maybe 25,000 miles on it. Because you pretty much can't leave Raleigh. And the Model S is 2 years and 4 months old. It'll have 100,000 miles at the end of the summer. And I'm like 94%.
Uh-huh, yeah.
Tesla, good. Nissan, bad.
Right. Now there's an effect there too, right? The Leaf has a lot smaller battery pack. So every time I drive, 80 miles in a Leaf, that's kind of putting as much wear and tear on the pack as driving 265 miles on the Model S. So we have to factor that in, but yeah, so it's interesting. I think the temperature dependence is a bigger red flag than that time thing, but I'm having a similar experience with our Leaf compared to our Roadster. Yep.
What struck me about your capacity loss graphs for the Model S 60 and 85 is that I perceived maybe a 5% drop in the first 30,000 miles, give or take, and then there was an interesting leveling off. Am I reading too much into that data, or do you agree with that?
If you look at the scientific papers on lithium-ion batteries, you'll see that where there's a sharp drop at the beginning and then relatively flat and then that drop off. So it's possible that that's what's going on. It's my understanding that for a lot of battery manufacturers, they precondition the battery pack so that drop happens before the car lands on your driveway. It could be that. It could also be that differences in firmware and the readings and things like that could also be affecting those early numbers. So I'm not 100% sure exactly what's going on there.
It does look very encouraging, but for whatever the reason was.
Yeah. And I also think it's interesting that there's a tremendous amount of variation from car to car, even a bigger variation than, the degradation that we're seeing. And I think some of that is the fact that the car is estimating that number. I mean, the only way you can really know that number is to throw it up on a testing bench and charge it up all the way and then discharge it in a controlled way. And obviously that's not, the car doesn't get that data from the way that you drive. And so, yeah, there's challenges in that measurement too. So, yeah.
Mel Herbert from the Talking Tesla podcast. 2 questions. One about, do you have any data on 100% charging versus 80% charging and its effect on degradation, and supercharging versus more standard charging? Does that affect battery life?
So I looked at that actually pretty carefully with the Leaf, and it didn't seem to make any difference, the 100% versus 80%. For the Model S, I haven't really looked at that much. One issue is that the majority of Model S owners don't do the 100% charge that often. I mean, you don't need a 100% charge if you're just driving around town. And also, if you're doing a big cross-country trip, you don't really need it because you're going to be stopping and charging at quick charging stations. So I don't think I have a lot of data on Model S owners who consistently charge to 100%, so I don't have a good way to measure that. Now, I do ask questions about how often you do quick charging, and I haven't looked at that. I'm hoping that I'll write a paper before the summer's out. I'll try to look at it there, and obviously anybody else, if you want to download the data, you can look at it also.
Tom, that was my question. I'll wait for your paper. Thank you.
Okay, great. Hey, I've already started writing it twice, so hopefully I'll finish it eventually. Hey, Jack.
Jack Bowers. I was one of the data points that was far out there on my P85. I sold that at about 92,000 miles. I wanted to alert you to the fact that Tesla's being a little bit sneaky on the Model S, at least with the early version. I don't know what they're doing with the D-Packs, but in addition to the miles dropping, they're also diluting the value of a range mile. When the car was new, I was getting 308 watt hours per mile, and around the time I sold it, it was close to about 275. So even though it would still charge to 148, I was effectively only getting about 125, 126 on the miles. And so the only true way you could tell how much was on the pack was to charge full and then take a trip that ran it to zero, and then it would show you the kilowatt hours used. And my pack, when it was new, it was 80.8, meaning that a little bit was in reserve. Around the time I sold it, it was about 70. I did loops around the Roseville Galleria and hit bottom when I was doing that test because I ran out right at zero. And when you hit bottom, you want to be within 300 yards of a charger. Luckily, I was.
Yeah, so that's we're in a tough situation where we're completely dependent on the car's instrumentation, and Tesla could totally fool around with that. And at the same time, they could be fooling around with where the zero is, right? Because they'd rather scare you a little than strand you a lot. And so that's another issue that makes this challenging. And that's another reason why I also ask for the firmware version, so as they fiddle with things, then I have the ability to just look at records from cars that are all running the same firmware. But of course, that's a constant moving target. So the good news is this is way better than the instrumentation on the Leaf that doesn't give you any sort of information about how much energy is in the battery pack. So we are very lucky as Tesla owners that Tesla gives us the data that they do. Yes, sir.
So I'm wondering, is there a conclusion that we can reach as how we can get the most life out of our battery packs? What charging should we do? How deeply do we dare to discharge? And along those lines, when you're estimating your pack cycles, how were you coming up with that? My drive to work is about 100 miles each way. So I'll drive to work, recharge, drive home. And is that any different from somebody who's going to be taking their pack down just 30 or 40 miles and recharging it versus somebody taking it deep into the pack? As I have done. I've seen 10 miles and had the car yelling at me to recharge it, So have I hurt things by doing that? Are there conclusions?
Yeah, so it would be difficult to collect that much data. I mean, some of the visual Tesla apps that are constantly recording, very detailed data. If I had that data set, then maybe I could look at that question. My belief is it probably doesn't matter much. I mean, unless you're driving it to 100% and driving it down to 5% on a consistent basis, it probably doesn't matter whether you're doing, 80 to 30 cycles or whether you're doing 75 to 50 cycles. I think it's not a big deal, and I think Tesla's doing a good job of keeping you out of the range of the battery that's going to harm the battery. And Tesla says, don't worry about it. Drive it however, you can't hurt your pack. Now, at the same time, let's be honest, they're not giving us any sort of a capacity warranty. So I think they're saying that you can't ruin your battery pack, but maybe you can lose some capacity. But I don't have any data that suggests that you need to be paranoid. I would use the car in the way that makes the most sense for you. If you don't need to charge above 80%, then don't charge above 80%. But if you do need to, then do it. Yeah.
So I just have sort of a comment on your V2G pricing numbers. And sort of the caveat to say that is those numbers were derived from usage of vehicle driving usage, whereas if it were plugged into the grid, the cycling would be much shallower and more frequent, especially if they were doing something like frequency regulation. And so that would probably tend to get more out of the packs and make those numbers lower instead of just long discharges over periods of time and long charges over periods of time.
That's a good point, yeah. So presumably if you're doing V to G, you're not pulling, 100 kilowatts out of the battery pack. You're probably doing a much milder discharge.
And not at the same connection thing, because when you're driving, you're discharging it, 100 kilowatts maybe when you're up at speed, as opposed to the 20 kilowatts you can get from the wall.
Right, yeah.
So there's some other things with that, but yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that Ted Marandino told us that they use slightly different battery chemistry to match the cycling that you'd be using for the Powerwall, and that's different than the cycling behavior in driving. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, great.
I was told by my service center, and I'm not sure if this is hot air or not, that if you don't get down toward the bottom with some regularity or occasionally, that the car loses sight of the bottom, and that actually it thinks or it will report to you that the bottom is higher than it really is. And this may create a flaw in your data.
Yeah, I totally believe that. If you don't show the car the full range of your battery pack, it's guessing. And lithium chemistry is pretty hard to measure the capacity, especially if I'm just only seeing the top part of the pack cycle. So, yeah, if you're curious to know how your battery pack's doing, I would definitely recommend, driving it down to 20% and then charging it up. So, yeah, that's a good point. It'd give you more accurate data.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom.